Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome to the Networking RX podcast. I'm your host, Frank Agin, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for opening my eyes to possible materials that are out there to talk about. When I first started this podcast, I'm like, okay, I'm going to run out of things pretty quickly. But I seem to have I don't want to say a never-ending treasure trove of things to touch on, but there seems to be a lot out there. I have a whole file, and the file seems to grow. I can't make a dent in it. Neither here nor there, but it kind of leads me into today's program a little bit, related, unrelated. I had a conversation with one of the directors of AmSpirit Business Connections. I'll leave the person nameless. It really doesn't matter. But there was one of their members who was complaining, and I was talking to them about the person's complaint. I don't normally do this, but it seemed warranted. I just wanted to certainly let the director know. For those who are not aware, directors are essentially franchisees in the organization. Anyhow, so I was talking to the particular director, and he said, yeah, I did say what the person said I said, and nobody else seemed to have a problem with it, was the comment that came out of his mouth. And I thought about that, and I didn't push back immediately, but I just said, it's possible. It's entirely possible that nobody said anything because they were afraid to say something. And, that happens from time to time. People don't speak up. There are situations where people just don't speak up. Things are wrong, and they don't agree with them, but they don't speak up. So I just let that conversation go, and that was, a few weeks ago. Shortly after that conversation, I was riding in the car. I had a long trip, 3 hours, extended period in the car, and I was listening to a podcast. The podcast is called Hidden Brain, and the host is Shankar Vedantam. I struggle with that name, but anyhow, Hidden Brain, I get that right every time. But Shankar does. I really enjoy the podcast because it talks about it talks about research that's going on out there. It talks about things that are going on in our brains, things that we do. A lot of it touches on relationships. At any rate, the guest he had on for that particular episode, and the particular episode was entitled "The Conspiracy of Silence." I believe that was the actual episode title. I can look that up real quick for us. A Conspiracy of Silence. And the description was, we're all self-censor at times. We keep quiet at dinner with our in-laws or nod passively in a work meeting. But what happens when we take this deception a step further and pretend we believe the opposite of what we really feel? And so this was a redo of a podcast that he aired in 2020. And on that, he interviewed economist and political scientist Timur Kuran. And Timur is at Duke University. At any rate, one of the many things that Timur looks into is what's called preference falsification. And how preference, and I went online, and Timur works for Duke. He has a paper out on this topic, Harvard Business Review, and then a book called Private Truths, Public Lies. And anyhow, preference falsification is the act of misrepresenting one's wants under perceived social pressures. One of the things they talk about in the podcast, they talk about you're at friends and somebody's suggesting, hey, well, why don't we watch this? They make a suggestion. There are four people there. Somebody makes a suggestion, thinking that you would want to watch that particular show. Now, you might say, okay, thinking other people want to watch the show. And at the end of it all, you come to realize that nobody really wanted to watch the show. You just felt that they wanted to watch it, so you went along with them, and they wanted to watch it because they figured it was something that you preferred. And that's preference falsification. And it's certainly, that's a minor thing. Well, maybe not a minor thing. It kills a whole evening watching a horrible movie or whatever it might be, playing a board game, whatever it might be. But we all engage in that. And on this particular podcast, it talked about some bigger issues with respect to that. You've had entire regimes that have really gotten everybody to go along, and people don't really go along. And the one example it talks about in there, when the fall of the Soviet Union happened, Czechoslovakia followed shortly thereafter, and in so doing, I believe it was the New York Times sent a reporter to Czechoslovakia to interview a former communist about what they thought. Hey, communist is gone now. And that particular reporter reported back, I can't find a communist, which was a clear indication, maybe not a clear indication, but an indication that, maybe nobody really believed in communism to begin with, and they just kind of went along, preference falsification. Yeah, I love communism. It's great, because to say otherwise would, you might meet with death in those situations, or find yourself in a concentration camp. Don't know which is worse. And, we see this in society today. Donald Trump's a figure that's easy to pick upon. But, Donald Trump, there are people in the Republican Party who don't necessarily want to stand up to Donald Trump. They might not agree with his means or his mean-spiritedness, but they don't want to take him on. They don't want to take him on because they're afraid of the repercussions. So they go along to get along, even though they don't agree. And once Donald Trump is out of power, and I don't know when that is. I don't know that he's going to run for 2024 presidential election. I don't know, or what role he'll have in that. But once there's a perception that he's no longer in power, I think you're going to find a lot more people who are going to be turning on Donald Trump. And it's the same on the left. There are things on the left. There are, the one example they used in the podcast, they talked about Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement. And out in California, in the summer of 2020 and on into 2021, there was this huge support for Black Lives Matter protests out there, social injustice, so on and so forth. And, hey, we need to fix systemic racism and do all these things. Shortly thereafter, there was something on the ballot in California to put a measure through in support of affirmative action. And the measure failed. It wasn't even close. It failed. Now, what that says is all the people who were out could say one of two things, right? Everybody who's out protesting was really a super minority, a very super vocal minority, and everyone else thought differently, or publicly people were in support of the things that Black Lives Matter were about, or but privately they weren't. Some might call this virtue signaling, but you would think, based on everything that was going on, and again, we don't know the numbers of who was out protesting or whatever, but based on everything going on and everything that you see in the media, that this proposal in California would pass resoundingly, and it got defeated. And so again, we're getting back to this whole notion of preference falsification, and people people will say something publicly or demonstrate something publicly. They'll put a sign in their yard or whatever, but their true feelings are something totally different. And this is happening time and again. Large companies will come out and say, "Hey, we're in support of this," and I guess I have a problem with companies dipping their toe in the political water, anyways, because um, it's I don't know. It's not really their place. You're speaking for potentially thousands of people, and you don't know. You're basically telling these thousands of people this is what they need to think, and somebody wants to hang on to their job, so they're going to engage in preference falsification. Yeah, okay, great, because they just can't up and leave a six-figure job and go find another six-figure job. And so you kind of force them into this preference falsification. But that's a whole nother conversation. I guess it gets into free speech, and this is not a political, by any means. This is not a political podcast. I'm just trying to draw some attention, some understanding as to why in a group people might seem to think one way, but privately think a whole different way. Why in a group they might say they're going to do something, but then when push comes to shove and they need to act individually, they don't. And it really comes down to preference falsification. And you see it. You do see it in business. You do see it in networking. People will there was a woman I know. She put together a whole product offering for her clientele, and nobody bought it. Now, when she talked to them in focus groups, yeah, this is great, and it's almost social conformity because they think everybody else thinks it's great. Yeah, this should be a good thing. This should be a good thing. But in private, when it came to one-on-one, actually to make a move and actually purchase whatever it was, they didn't, because their enthusiasm for the product, and it doesn't matter what the product is or was not as high as they seemed to indicate. And partially she was asking the wrong questions and went about it the wrong way. But again, back to this director who's at a chapter and saying something, and nobody's really taking issue with it, and him hanging his hat on the notion that nobody took issue with it, so I guess it's okay, is really not a strong argument, right? And I've reached out to this particular person, and I shared that podcast with him. I have shared it with him. I don't know that he's listened to it. And just said, you need to listen to this and try and understand why in a group setting someone might take issue with you and nobody else says anything. And in reality, if there's one person taking issue with you, you can kind of look at that person and say, oh, what a doofus. Why are you taking issue with me? Nobody else seems to have a problem. They may be the person that you need to thank, because they may be the courageous representation of a silent majority, and the rest of the people are just kind of exercising preference falsification because they're a little bit afraid of what speaking up might mean. And so we just kind of have to take a look and just say, okay, really kind of question the things we do. And again, nobody's wrong in this. One of the things I said to this particular director was, you're not a bad person. I'm not saying you're a bad person. You're anything but a bad person. Maybe you shouldn't have said what you said. Maybe it could have been couched a different way. We all make mistakes. You're not a bad person. This person who is taking issue with you is not a bad person. We're just trying to communicate with one another. And all these people who are engaging in or presumably engaging in preference falsification, they're not bad people either. You're all just people. And it's just something that we do as people. There's this saying out there, you just need to pick your battles. And sometimes that's what people do. You know what? I'm going to pick my battles. This is not something I need to speak up about. I find myself doing that. Things are happening. It's like, yeah, it's not worth the fight. I'm just going to let it go. I'll fight when I need to fight. But I'm not going to fight on every little issue. It's not worth the energy. So anyhow, if you get a chance, Hidden Brain podcast, I recommend it. It's certainly something to dig into. I don't listen to all the episodes. I certainly read the previews of it. Or of the episode and see if it's something that interests me. But this one in particular, again, it's called A Conspiracy of Silence. It came out in 2020, originally came out in 2020, and then the rebroadcast came out in 2022. I want to say the rebroadcast was the weekend of, the weekend of April 16th, 17th. Well, actually, I'm looking at it now. It was republished. It was originally published April 14th. No, it was republished April 14th, 2022. About 56 minutes. Very good, very insightful. Uses a lot of politics, geopolitics, and more macro type settings as well. But it really kind of gives you some insight as to what's going on with people in your network.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AMSPIRIT.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.